The magical, mystical barn, and other wonderful buildings. In addition to having a house into which we could move immediately, the new farm had buildings, lots of buildings. There were count 'em, two chicken coops. One was all wood and one was built of concrete blocks. There were no chickens yet. There was a 4-car garage at the end of the chicken coops, and across from it a milk house right behind the rear kitchen porch. Upon entering the milk house, one was all wood, one was built of concrete blocks. There were no chickens yet. There was a 4-car garage at the end of the chicken coops, and across from it a milk house right behind the rear kitchen porch. Upon entering the milk house, one walked upon a concrete floor, about 4 inches below the door sill. At the far end of the floor, about 8 feet from the door, was another sill, and beyond that was a well, about 4 feet deep, as long as the building was wide, and about 2 feet wide. When a farmer milked cows into a bucket, the bucket was emptied into a 5 or 10-gallon milk can. When the milking was finished, the cans of milk were taken to the milk house and placed into the well, which was filled with cold water to just below the neck of the can. This kept the milk chilled until it was either used by the family, if they had only 1 or 2 cows, or until the dairy hauler came to buy it. Next to the milk house stood a granary, a large, musty-smelling wooden building with stiff wire covering louvers in the upper walls. Inside the building were rooms, strangely built doors, and wall entries through which grain was blown or conveyor carried into the rooms. The rooms were all empty at the time, but the main entry hall hosted a hand-operated cast-iron machine that was destined later to be a great nemesis of mine, a corn sheller, designed to remove the kernels of hard field corn from the cob rapidly and efficiently, so long as the operator was capable of turning the crank and keeping the gears turning. Husked, as bare corn on the cob, is fed into the top. Cobs fall out one side into a basket, and the kernels fall out the other. Finally, standing as a barrier between the back edge of the lawn and the hayfield, stood the barn, a magnificent 2-story structure of many uses. Of the board and batten construction, painted gray and well-weathered, the barn guarded the rear of the living area of the farm. Board and batten construction consisted of wide boards nailed vertically across the length of the outside of a wall, with roughly 1 inch of space between each two. Then 2-inch boards were nailed over the 1-inch space. The smaller boards were nailed only through the gaps between the larger boards, creating a not quite tight overlap that moved with the expansion of heat and cold, but precluded the necessity to finish plane the larger boards so they could be butted together. It also allowed for air to exchange while keeping the wind out. You'd pay a lot for those boards today. The barn became our playground, our fort, our monkey bars, and a mountain range. A third of the lower front was a large room into which we stored hay. We also had 2 upper-level hay mows, although the lower-level mow extended all the way to the roof. Down in the rear of the lower level was a concrete-floored dairy room with milking stanchions and a second, smaller, dirt-floored room. In the 2/3 of the lower front, not used for hay, were 3-horse stables and an area for tack. We bought a milking Guernsey every spring, milked her until about November, and when she dried up, she became steaks, roasts, and hamburger. So we kept hay in the lower mow, and because it wasn't really full, we had steps and shelves of hay to climb up and jump down from the upper row. Of course, the old square bales would break open, and the old man would throw a fit about people who walked on someone else's, in this case, our cow's food, but it didn't stop us. Clambering around that old barn was our favorite thing to do for many, many years. Of course, as we got older, there were more chores than play days. The cow was ours, Giles and mine, to feed and milk as we got older. A Guernsey gave a good 5 gallons of milk, from which up to a gallon of cream could rise while it sat in the milk house overnight. The old man would assemble the cream separator every 2 or 3 days and pour the milk into it slowly through folded cheesecloth. You don't want to think about what gets into hand-milked milk. Well, I cranked it. The nested centrifuges would spin at different rates, and cream would pour out the top spout into a pitcher that sat on a built-in shelf, while milk came out the bottom spout into another 10-gallon milk can. Once the cream was separated, it was poured into a geared butter churn. The CIA had nothing on the guy who invented this torture device. The churn consisted of a square 2-gallon glass container into which a screw lid containing a 4-paddle device was lowered. A crank with a large cogged wheel was attached. The cogged wheel turned against a much smaller cogged wheel through which the churn paddle protruded. When the crank was turned slowly, the paddle turned more rapidly, forever. And it was hard work. Churning butter was a slow process. It took most of a day. Well, an hour anyway, for the first little yellow blobs to show up. For another half hour, they would slowly coalesce, sticking to the wooden paddles little by little, and the more that stuck, the harder the paddles turned. Eventually, I would be unable to turn it rapidly enough to finish, and the old man or my mother would take over. It was a proud day for me when I could finish the job. I must have been at least 12. But we always had the barn. Well into our teens, that barn gave us a place to be when it rained outside or stormed inside. The marriage of the old man and my mother was not a quiet one. We would climb and clamber, play knights against evil, cowboys and Indians, war games, and a host of other imaginative things that I can no longer recall. But we grew older. The games became more dramatic. One Saturday, when I was maybe 11, Mother called us to lunch. Lindella and I appeared at the table, but no Giles. After a minute or two, Mother spoke up. "Where is your brother?" "Hanging out in the barn," replied little sister. "Hanging out with whom?" Mother was losing patience. "Not with anybody. He's just hanging out there." Mother exploded from her chair, raced through the kitchen door, and headed for the barn. Lindella and I just looked at each other. After all, Giles was the bad guy. If we'd cut him down for lunch, we'd just have to hang him up again, right? Anyway, we'd strung the rope under one armpit and tied it against the other side of his neck. He'd be okay. Hattie Laurelham, all 5 feet 10 inches of her, quivered with appalled rage as she carried Giles into the house and laid him on the sofa in the living room. A raw steak lay across his upper chest and throat where the rope, really baling wire, had rubbed skin away as he struggled to escape. She took a deep breath and stood glaring down at 2 suddenly terrified children. Don't ever put a rope around someone's neck. Ever. She turned and walked into the bathroom, from which came the sounds of quiet sobbing. It was years before she ever mentioned it again. Behind the barn was a pig pen. No, really, a building and a fenced yard for pigs. There was a large fenced area into which the cow was released. In the center of it stood a wooden shed with its own chain-link fenced area. The building was filthy, and it smelled of pigs. In fact, the only times we, Giles and I, ever entered it were the few summers during which we had pigs, and the 2 of us were assigned to feed them.